Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at another short Latin story. Now this is the story of Polycrates. We already did part one. This is part two and it's called The Advice of Amasis. Now this comes from George L. Bennett's Easy Latin Stories for Beginners. And you've heard me say this a lot. What Bennett is calling easy stories for beginners in 1879 are not necessarily easy. They're also not exactly what I call for beginners. So if you haven't watched any of the videos I've made from his book, I would just say that these are probably best pegged at like a Latin 2, maybe Latin 3 range. They're definitely not for someone who only has 1 year Latin under the belt. I think that would be difficult. Most times, if you're taking Latin 1 in school, you're not seeing the more advanced things that come up in some of these stories. So I would say give it a year of taking Latin. Maybe if you're in Latin 2, a little further on into the Latin 2 curriculum, you'll probably be ready to try this. But whenever you can understand and read these, right, give it a shot. Wherever you are in Latin 2, Latin 3, give it a shot. And if you're able to read through this and it makes sense, then you're in a good spot, right? But if you try to read this and it just seems completely random, you don't know what's going on, that's a good sign that you're probably not ready for it. But again, Latin 2, Latin 3 is kind of where I would peg a lot of these stories. So the reason that I like using Bennett is they give you a chance to really break free of a normal curriculum. You've heard me say this before. A lot of textbooks are pretty generic with the stories they tell. Maybe they follow a family or something like that. These are coming from, a lot of these from Herodotus, like this story. But Bennett is picking a lot from ancient Greek and Roman history, a little bit of mythology. Some of these have like a moral value to them. So they're just different stories that you don't get in a normal Latin textbook. And that's why they're really valuable. So again, take them for what it's worth. But I think it's always a great way to kind of break free and just read something different. So in this video, we're going to continue the story of Polycrates, right? He's the tyrant of Samos. And in part one, we discussed his rise to power, his conquests, and his immense wealth, right? He's very, very wealthy. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to dive more into his friendship with the Egyptian pharaoh named Amasis, who we saw in part one, but now you're going to see them interact a little bit more in part two, and you're going to kind of see a little story about fate and how that all kind of ties together, okay? But before we dive too far into it, like I always say, the first thing you want to do in these videos is if you want, make a vocab list. I don't think any really exist for Bennett. So maybe pre-read, try to write down any words you don't know at first glance, make a little vocab list, learn the words, because again, it's very difficult to understand what's going on if you don't know what the words mean. The other thing that I always recommend is read this aloud, right? These stories are fun. They're pretty short. If you're in a class, find a classmate, read it to that person. That way you can work on your speaking, your pronunciation. They can read it back to you so you can work on your listening skills. You never want to shut those off and just read these in your head. Now, to help you with that, in case you don't have anyone to read it with, I'll start by reading the story to you, right? Not that my pronunciation is anything fantastic, but at least you have someone reading it to you so you can hear it and try to work on those listening skills. But when it comes time to reading and kind of translating, if you are looking to really dive in and make sure you have a good translation on this, I'd always recommend you do the read and reread method. So you read through the story once, you write down any areas that you're struggling with, you try to fix them, look them up, whether it's grammar, vocab, whatever it might be, and then reread the story over and over again until your list gets down to nothing, right? And you can read this start to finish without any trouble. That's how you know you're in a good spot and you're probably ready to move on, okay? So if you haven't done that yet or done any of the prep work, pause the video, go do it. But otherwise, let's start by reading the story together, right? I'll read the Latin to you, and then we'll kind of translate it and make sure that we're on the right track, okay? So the story goes like this. Ia felicitas Polycrates amasi placeba, sed ea res illi curae erat. Misis egitor, literis haec ad eum perscripsit. Amasis Polycrates salutum dicit. Placet valde mihi felicitas tua. Ad mihi non placent tuae res nimium secundae. Invidum est numen deorum qui mundum regunt. Itaque omnes, qui nimium florentibus rebus usi sunt, postremo pessimos finem habuerunt. Tu ergo, meum secutis consilium adversus illam tuam nimiam felicitatem fac hoc. Illud abice, quod maxime tibi est preti. His perlectis Polycrates amici monitus paruit. Erat ei annulus, quem gestabat, auro vinctus ex smaragdo lapide, Theodori opus artificis preclari. In navem conscendit, et detractum de manu annulum conspecientibus cunctis qui in navi erant in mare projecit. Hoc facto domum navigavit. at quinto aut sexto die postea res ei accidit huius modi. Piscator quidam ingentem piscem quem ceperat regidedit. Famili vero qui piscem coquebant in eos ventre Polycrates annulum reperiunt. Okay, let's pause the video right there. Again, just so you can hear it once. My pronunciation, again, nothing fantastic, but it's something if you don't have a classmate or someone to read this with, at least you have something to go off of. Okay, so go do the work of translating if you haven't already, because we're about to dive in and translate it now. You want to make sure that your translation is somewhere in the vicinity of mine, and you can kind of use it as a double check to make sure you're on the right track. Okay, so we start by talking about the felicitas Polycrates, right? The prosperity of Polycrates. It was pleasing to Amasis, right? So Amasi placebam. But the same, and it really means like the same thing, right? Ares, that thing. So that same thing was a concern for him, right? So he's getting worried about his friend. He's happy that he's, making a ton of money, but he's also a little concerned that he's making a little too much or he's getting a little too greedy. Okay, so then you have misis igitor literis. So he sends a letter. So you have therefore having sent a letter, right? He wrote these things to him, right? Haec ad eum perscripsit. So he writes him a letter. And he says, Amasis, right? Polycrates salutum dicit. So Amasis sends greetings to Polycrates, right? Kind of a traditional opening to a letter. So he says, I hope you're doing well, my friend, right? Then you have placet valde. So your prosperity, right? Felicitas tua, your prosperity is very pleasing to me, right? Placet valde mihi. So he says, I'm happy about this. He says, at mihi non placet tuae res nimium secundae. But you're excessively favorable, might be kind of the way to do it. The nimium secundae, you're excessively good fortune, right? Fortunes do not please me. So he's saying, again, this is him kind of articulating, I'm happy that you're doing well, but you're doing really, really well, right? You're making a ton of money. It's making me a little bit nervous, okay? So he says, in vidam est numen deorum, right? So the divine power of the gods, right? The numen, that divine power of the gods who rule, qui mundum regut, who rule the world, is envious. So he's saying, be careful here, right? You don't want to think of yourself as being godly with all this wealth, okay? And you have itaque omnes, qui nimium florentibus rebus usi sunt. So he says, and so all who enjoy excessively flourishing things, I guess is kind of how you do florentibus rebus, right? Things that are too good is kind of the idea. Postremo pessimum finem habuerunt, right? At last, they've had the worst end. So in other words, the pessimum finem, the worst end. So he's saying the people who have enjoyed and really used the most excessively great things, they have really terrible fates, right? Pessimum finem, the worst ends is kind of what he's getting at. So he's warning his friends saying, it's okay to have a ton of money. It's not okay to go way too far and be so greedy that something bad is going to happen to you. So he's worried that something bad will happen to his friend because of all this wealth that he has, okay? And again, this is where you can see like fate kind of coming into it. And he says, tu ergo meum secutis consilium. So he says, you therefore, following my advice, right? Meum consilium. He says, following my advice, adversus illam tuam nimiam felicitatem fac hoc, right? So he says, following my advice, and it's that advice against that excessive prosperity of yours, right? He says, do this, fac hoc. So he's telling him what to do. He says, illud abice, quod maximi tibi est preti. So he says, throw away, right? Toss out that thing which is of the greatest value to you, right? Quod maximi tibi est preti. So he says, the thing that you cherish the most, right? Most dear to you, toss it, right? That's my warning. He said, because we don't want to have too much greed going on here, right? We don't want to get too greedy and have something bad happen to you. Then you have kind of the response to this letter. So you have his perlectis Polycrates amici monitus paruit. So having read through these things, right? Having read through these things, Polycrates, he obeyed the advice of his friend, right? The monitis amici. So he sees the warning coming from his friend. He's like, you know what? He's right. That's a good idea. Let me toss something, okay? Then you have era ei annulus, right? So there was for him a ring. You could say he had a ring. It would mean the same thing, right? But he had a ring which he wore, quem gestaba, right? Which he wore all the time. And the ring is described as auro vinctus ex smaragdo lapide, right? So bound in gold, right? Kind of wrapped up in gold, auro vinctus. It's a golden ring. And then it's made from smaragdo. Now, I'll be honest, I had to look this word up, so this is why I'm saying pre-reading is always good. It's an emerald, right? So a green stone, a smaragdo lapide, right? So he has a golden ring, right? A ring wrapped or bound in gold with an emerald, a green stone, an emerald stone in the middle of it. And it's described as Theodori opus, the work of Theodorus, and Artificis Praeclari, a famous craftsman, right? You could say. So he has this famous ring that he wears all the time, and this is the thing that's the most valuable to him. So he's going to take Amasis's advice and toss it, right? So we continue with in navem conscendit, et detractum de manu annulum conspicientibus cunctis qui in navi errant in mare proiecit. Okay, so he goes on a ship, he boarded a ship in navem conscendit, right? So he gets on a boat, and having removed the ring, right, detractum annulum, having taken off the ring from his hand, de manu, and with everyone, cunctis, with everyone watching, right, conspicientibus cunctis, so with everyone on the watching who was on the ship, qui in navi errant. So in other words, in the view of everyone who was on the ship, in mare proiecit, he threw it into the sea. So he takes off his ring, he makes sure everyone's watching, he chucks it into the Mediterranean Sea, and he feels like he's kind of gotten rid of this possible curse, right, on the advice of Amasis. Then you have hoc facto domum navigavet. So with this having been done, or having been done this, he sailed home, right? So he goes back home. Then you have ad quinto aut sexto die postea res ei accidit huius modi. So, but on the fifth or the sixth day, so quinto aut sexto, so 5 or 6 days later is kind of the idea. But on the fifth or sixth day afterward, right, die postea, something of this kind, right, huius modi, happened to him, right? So a thing happened to him of this kind, right? It's about to say what it is. So something weird happened to him is kind of the idea. 5 or 6 days later, okay? And you have piscator, right? Piscator quidam, really. So some fisherman, a certain fisherman. Ingentem piscem quem ceperat regi dedit. So a certain fisherman, regi dedit, gave to the king, meaning to Polycrates, an ingentem piscem, a huge fish, right, which he had caught, right? Quem ceperat. So this fisherman goes out, tosses in a line, catches this giant fish, and he gives it to the king as like a tribute. He's like, hey, look at this awesome fish I found. You can eat it. Okay, why not? Then you have the last line here, kind of the punchline, the twist of fate. You have family vero, qui piscem coquebat in eos ventre Polycrates annulum reperiunt, I should say. So the family are the servants, right? So the servants who were cooking the fish, qui piscem coquebat, right? So the fisherman brought a fish as tribute to the king. The slaves are now, cooking it, getting ready to make it for the king. And what happens? Well, they discovered reperiunt, they discovered in eos ventre, in its belly, meaning in the belly of the fish, they discovered Polycrates annulum, the ring of Polycrates, right? So this is the thing he tried to get away, or to throw away, because his friend had said, hey, this isn't going to end well. You're kind of tempting fate here. You better toss the ring, right? But we see that fate plays a trick on him, right? The ring comes back. So this is kind of, again, part 2. There's one more part, a little bit left in the story, part 3, about his fate. But you can see there's sort of a moral value here, right? The idea of greediness and not being too greedy, and what happens to people who are greedy. They have bad ends. Polycrates tries to escape his bad end on the advice of his friend, and the thing that he tossed comes right back to him. So you can kind of already tell this isn't going to go very well for Polycrates, right? But again, it's just a fun story, something different. It gets a little weird with some of the vocab, and it's a little bit longer, right, this story. But again, it's something that if you're in that, Latin 2 range, Latin 3 range, whatever, it should be something that you can handle without too much difficulty. And it's just something that lets you break free from what you normally read in a Latin textbook. Okay. If you have any questions at all, put them in the comments below. I'm always happy to help you out. If there's anything you thought about, the translation or something I missaid, put it in there. I'm sure it happened, right? Just let me know. But otherwise, keep at it, keep practicing, and keep reading this, right, until you're able to read all the way through without any trouble. That's how, like I said, how you always know that you're ready to move on. Good luck with it.